So I was scheduled to be gone last week anyway, but then our volunteers and even our staff are so thin last week with so many were sick or somebody in their family was sick, but we couldn't have Sunday school. So I really hate, I was going to have Matt teach. It was his last week to be here as on our staff, and so I hate that you missed getting to hear Matt, but we'll try and pick up and go on where we left off. And also next week, I hope to have for you a little paper schematic of the temple, and you're going to see how the tabernacle transitioned to the temple, how it goes from being a temporary dwelling to be a permanent dwelling, but the layout is the same and the articles of furniture in it are the same. So you'll see how close that is. But also, we want to know the temple because, of course, that was the temple was very, very prominent in the life of Jesus. So remember, when we talk about the tabernacle, we are looking at it from this side of the cross. We have deeper understanding of what it meant. That is not to say that the Bible is exhaustive in explaining everything in the tabernacle. There are some things God never says that this stands for such and such. There are a lot of it does, but then we don't know. Do the brass sockets stand for something in salvation? We don't know, but the Bible doesn't purport to be exhaustive in what it teaches us. It just purports to be sufficient. In other words, God's told us everything we need to know, but that doesn't mean He's told us everything that is knowable, and certainly that's true of the tabernacle. But we certainly have sufficient knowledge of what it means. So today I want us to look at the holy place. Remember, you had the courtyard. This is like the layout. You have the courtyard fence around it, the gate in the front. Now, within that courtyard fence, you had the bronze altar, and you had the brazen laver that the priest would use to wash before they went in. And then the tabernacle proper, or what's called the tent of meeting. So here's the bronze altar, and this is where it's showing up there. You guys can see the dot there. I can't see it back there, but this is the bronze altar. So this is where the vast majority of sacrifice is made, and Jewish men can come in these gates. Women would be outside. Of course, in the tabernacle proper, the Levites are immediately encamped around the tabernacle, and then beyond the Levites were the 12 tribes, 3 on each side of the tabernacle. So men could bring their offering inside this gate. It would be slain there and offered on the altar. Priest would then, like they were to sprinkle some blood at the door of the tabernacle, the priest would have to wash in this brazen or brass laver and then proceed through the veil to the inside. Now this is called, in the Bible, this is called the tabernacle. So the courtyard is not properly the tabernacle. Just this part right there is the tabernacle. It's also called, in the ESV and a lot of modern translations, they call it the tent of meeting. And of course, that's sort of based on two things. In fact, this is where God meets with His people. He dwells among His people here. Tabernacle is a tent, or the verb form of it means to pitch a tent. And so this is God pitching a tent to dwell with His people. And this is the tent of meeting, is where God meets with His people through the sacrifice, through the high priest, at the very beginning through Moses. So when we go inside the courtyard, we go to the most holy place, or to the holy place rather. So inside the tabernacle, it's divided into two parts: the holy place and the most holy place. The holy place, so the more than one priest could go in there. The high priest alone could go into the most holy place, but only certain priests could go within the holy place. Now, what priest? Because there are literally hundreds and thousands of priests, and you can't have hundreds and thousands going in there. And so they divided them up into orders, and they divided the service into 24 orders. So I think the way it worked was that you were on for basically 2 weeks out of the year. If you look at the lunar calendar, you've got 12 months, and so if you have 24 orders, they're each serving 2 weeks. I think they would divide it up so you served a week at a time, twice a year. And each order was given a name based on the priest at the time when they came up with this scheme, and they're all listed in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we know, remember that Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, is a priest, and he's of the order of Abijah or Abiyah, depending on how you pronounce it, whether you anglicize it or not. But he's of the course of Abiyah, and it's his turn to be in the holy place, when the angel Gabriel appears to him and announces to him that Elizabeth is going to have a son, and they're going to call his name John. And it is right here where that takes place. And he was one of those priests. But the reason he's in there, it was his turn. So only certain priests got to go in there. They had to be of the order that was serving at that time. It had to be their turn. And then even within the order, only one guy goes in there in the evening to do the evening stuff, to light the lamp and make sure that it's cared for and all that. And that's what Zechariah was doing. So there are 3 pieces of furniture in there, and they're obvious there. You can see the golden lampstand, the altar of incense, and then the table of, King James calls it the table of showbread. It's also called the bread of the presence. And each one of these in the holy place picture some aspect about Christ and about salvation. I've pretty much told you that. The dimensions of the holy place, it's 10 cubits wide by 20 cubits long, meaning 15 feet by 30 feet. And the first article of furniture you get to is the golden lampstand. It's sometimes called, in King James, it's called the golden candlestick. But lampstand is more accurate to our minds because when we think of a candlestick, we think of wax candles, and there's nothing wax on this. This would burn oil, specifically, I think olive oil, and it is it is the only source of light in the holy place. So you've got the thick covering, several layers thick on top, and then the outer veil, and then it's separated from the Ark of the Covenant by the inner veil. And the priest had to trim the wicks daily to keep them burning brightly. And this is made from a single piece of gold. It is not pieced together. It's a monolith. The central shaft is made, and then it's got 6 branches, 3 on each side, making it a 7-branched lampstick. So when you see this is representative of the temple. Now, if you see I think a menorah is 9, and that's for Hanukkah. That's a different thing. But the golden candlestick had 7 places. Each branch had knobs, flowers, and an almond-shaped bowl to hold pure olive oil. We don't know exactly how tall it is. It's described in Exodus 25:31 through 40. It would obviously have to be relatively the height of an average man, so because the priest would have to light it and pour oil in it, and it would make sense for it to be far above him. But obviously, I mean, this shows up in the New Testament in several ways. One is Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And the description of God, God is light. And the light shines in darkness. Everything about this speaks of Christ. And why 7? Well, the 7 is the number of perfection. And the book of Proverbs, wisdom is described. Wisdom has 7 pillars, the 7 spirits of God before the throne. All of that testifies of really the wisdom and the complete wisdom, the perfect wisdom of the Holy Spirit. And of course, Jesus is the fullness of the Godhead bodily. In him dwells all wisdom. And so the candlestick really beautifully represents Christ. And when you see in the book of Proverbs the 7 spirits of wisdom, and wisdom has 7 pillars, and in Jesus all the wisdom of God dwells. I mean, you can just see how all this comes together, and Jesus is the light. This is a beautiful picture of him. Now, the table of showbread, also called the table of the presence, the priest would place 12 loaves of bread made from fine flour. Of course, this represents the 12 tribes of Israel. And they did this once a week. The loaves were a continual reminder of the everlasting promises between God and the children of Israel, and the memorial of God's provision of food. And once a week, when they would change the bread had to be eaten by Aaron and his sons, or by the descendants of Aaron, the Levites. So it's out for seven days, and it pictures basically that the bread represents a lot of things. Certainly the bread represents God's sustenance to his people, but the way he provides for them, but it also represents the way God's people must feed on him. And this is why they didn't just change the bread out on the 7th day. They had to eat it. They had to consume it. And so this had been offered to the Lord, consecrated by being there in the temple. On the 7th day, the priest would eat it and then replace it. And the ark of furniture itself, the table, is made of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. It has a crown or frame of gold around it. And then it had gold poles that would go through the sockets on the side so that it could be carried. There were also pieces of serviceware that went with it. There were gold dishes, pans, pitchers, and bowls. This table is a yard long. It's 36 inches by 18 inches by 27 inches. And it's mentioned in Exodus chapter 25, verses 23 through 30, where we're told where God tells Moses how to do it. But it's also mentioned basically in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 2, where the writer is talking about the first covenant. He says, now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. So the writer to the Hebrews is telling about this first covenant, and he goes through all of the ritual duties. But then he says in verse 17, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood. So you want a good theology of the tabernacle, you read Hebrews chapter 9, because the writer there lays it out. Here's exactly the way it worked. This was the old covenant. This was God showing these pictures. But when Christ appeared as a high priest, then he says, then this old is done away with. He enters once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. Now notice how different that is. What did I tell you about this? They had to eat this bread how often? Once a week. And every week you've got to do it again, do it again, do it again. It never ends. You could be a priest, and this is your job your whole life. Once a week, eating that bread and putting out new. And it was quite a ceremony. We know from in different Jewish writings, and Josephus, he talks about it, the way that they would do this. It was real ceremonial. 4 priests entering in, and they're escorted, and the way they do everything, it was highly stylized. But what the writer to the Hebrews is saying is, but when Jesus came, all that was done away with. And that should never be lost on us. This is why I object to any Christians who talk about building a third temple and helping the Jews reestablish the sacrificial system. Well, that's dishonoring to what Christ has done. He abolished this by means of his own blood. He secured an eternal redemption. It's not just a weekly reminder. By the way, can you remember, is there any example in the Bible of anyone who was not a priest who ever ate that bread? David and his men. And Jesus talked about that. Jesus pulled that up as an example. So David and his men were on the run from Saul. Saul was out to kill them, to kill David, though he'd done nothing wrong. And they got there to Shiloh, to where the ark was, the tabernacle was set up. And he says to the high priest, man, we're starving. We don't have anything to eat. Can you give us anything? And he says, we don't have any food. The only thing we have is the bread of the presence. And David says, well, let us have that. And there's sort of a little bit of a negotiation. He says, well, that's really for the priest, but he doesn't want David and his men to starve. And so he says, okay, well, at least if you have not defiled yourself with women. And David said, we've not been even around women. We were on the run from Saul. We've not had relations with women, and we're good. And so the high priest gives it to him. There's an Edomite there named Doeg who witnesses this and then later tells Saul. So Saul kills the high priest who gives that to David. And the question might be, well, was it wrong for David to take it? Jesus picks this story up in the New Testament, and he argues that it wasn't wrong, that there was a greater principle than the ritual, and that was the life of David and his men, that they were given this to keep them from starving, and that they ate the showbread. And so Jesus uses that as an example of sometimes there's something more significant than the ritual, the routine, and the principle of life is more significant. So the table of showbread, the bread of the presence, matters significantly. Then the third piece in there is the altar of incense. It is here that the high priest burned incense on the altar of incense every morning and evening. So at first light in the morning, the incense would be burned. And the 4 corners of the altar each had a horn. See the horns on there, and a crown or a molding on the edge. And once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the horns of that altar would be sprinkled with the blood of the sin offering. So when the high priest makes the sacrifice for the sins of the people, before he goes in to the Ark of the Covenant, into the most holy place, he sprinkles the blood on the 4 horns of this incense offering. And the Lord required that special incense, he gave them a specific recipe. This is the incense that I want burned on there. It had to be constantly on the altar of incense. And it's a sweet incense, a mixture of spices to be used only for the tabernacle. No one else was allowed to use that recipe for any kind of incense or odor. It was supposed to be proprietary, if you will, specific to the tabernacle. And the incense was a matter of life and death. God took it very seriously, because when Aaron's sons offer a strange fire, so they mess with the recipe. They think they can improve on the recipe, and they offer that before the Lord. God struck them dead. So once again, it shows how seriously God takes worship. And in the Old Covenant, remember the Old Covenant is all about how hard it is for you to get to God. It is a series of prohibitions. It is a series of difficulties. The whole point is to show you can't do it. You can't get to God on your own. And God took that worship very, very seriously. It's the Old Covenant that leads us to the grace of the New Covenant. As New Covenant believers, we should be so grateful that all God requires of us is faith. That is the thing that pleases him, that we've put faith in his Son. Because you see, to be an Old Covenant believer, imagine Aaron's sons. These are the nephews of Moses. They're privileged in many, many ways, and they get to minister in the tabernacle, but they change the recipe, and God strikes them dead. Later, we'll talk about the Ark of the Covenant, and when David moves the Ark to Jerusalem, and instead of carrying it the way God told them to, they put it on a new cart, and when the ox stumbles, Uzzah puts his hand up to stay the ark, and God strikes him dead. So you see, God takes his worship very, very seriously. He does not want the picture broken, and that's why he gives such specific instructions. This altar was made from acacia wood. It was covered with gold. It's about 1.5 feet square by 3 feet high, and it also has the poles through the sockets to be carried. This is where in Luke 1:5-17, Zechariah is putting the incense on the altar in the evening when Gabriel appears to him and announces that God had heard Zechariah's prayers and that he and his wife would have a son. There's even a beautiful picture in that, isn't there? Because the altar of incense, for one thing, the New Testament talks about the prayers of the saints ascending to the Lord like a fragrant incense. In the same way, Paul says that we are the savor of Christ. We are the smell of Christ. To those that are perishing, we're the smell of death unto death. But to those that are being saved, we're the smell of life unto life. And what Paul's showing there is that the reaction to the gospel message, it's the same incense, it's the same thing, but to some they have one reaction: oh, that's life, and others, I want nothing to do with that. That's death. So you see this metaphor of fragrance and incense used throughout, no more so than with Jesus himself. That Jesus' sacrifice of himself is a fragrant offering to the Lord. So the altar of incense portrays the prayers of people, the devotion of Christ, his obedience. I think John the Baptist, in the same way that the altar of incense had to be sprinkled with blood before the priest goes into the holy place where atonement is made, John the Baptist, whose birth is announced at the altar of incense, has to come before the Lord. He prepares the way for the Lord to offer himself as a sacrifice. So all of this is pictured there in the tabernacle. And then from the holy place, you go to the most holy place, also called the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, the Sanctus Sanctorum. It goes depending on what language you're speaking, but you'll hear it referred to in all these ways. So the most holy place, you see here a cutaway view of what it looked like behind the curtain, the veil. And the high priest only entered into the most holy place one day a year. So 364 days a year, the tabernacle is set up, and no one ever goes into the most holy place. No one enters in there at all. That veil hangs there with its foreboding. It basically says you cannot come. And only one day a year does anyone go. And on that day, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the high priest enters in to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat to atone for his sins and the people's sins. And the focus in there, of course, is the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is that whole piece of furniture. The top of it, like the tabletop of it, is called the mercy seat. The Greek word in the New Testament is hilasterion. It'll be translated as mercy seat or place of atonement. But that's also simply the word for it can be translated redemption or atonement or propitiation. And so when it says that Christ was made our propitiation for sins, the word that's used is the same word elsewhere translated mercy seat. So the name of that table, the hilasterion, the mercy seat, is also the word for propitiation, that Jesus propitiates God, that he offers a sacrifice to satisfy God. And so you can clearly see the typology. Jesus is the mercy seat. What this points to is that in salvation, Jesus is everything. He's the high priest who sprinkles the blood. He's the lamb who is slain and whose blood is sprinkled. And he is the place of atonement. He is the propitiation. He's the one who receives. So when you see that Jesus is the fullness, in him dwells the fullness of the Godhead bodily, we're told that Jesus is absolutely God. Don't ever think of somehow there are two gods and Jesus is doing one thing in our salvation and God is doing something else. The Bible says that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. A lot of times preachers get almost heretical when they preach on the crucifixion. We overemphasize the business about God turning his back on his son and make it sound like there are two gods, and we sort of leave the Holy Spirit out completely. But he's one God in three persons, and Christ, the second person of the Trinity, is the person of the Trinity that enters time and relates to humanity. But make no mistake about it, all three persons of the Godhead are involved in our salvation. And there's a sense in which Christ is the fulfillment of all these pictures. He's the priest, he's the lamb, he's the blood, he's the mercy seat. He is the throne of God. He's the God who receives propitiation. Because ultimately the covenant is God's covenant with himself. These covenants with humanity are simply that we might know about God's covenant with himself, that he covenanted with himself to save us. So this mercy seat, 10 cubits long, 15 feet long by 15 feet wide. That's the largest piece of furniture in the tabernacle. It's described in Exodus 26, 33 through 34, but in Hebrews 9, verse 3, behind the second curtain was a second section called the Most Holy Place, having the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold. And now here we're told what was in the Ark of the Covenant. There was and by the way, this is, I think only here in the Bible where we're told all three of these things, because they happen over the course of time, that they're added. So there is the golden urn holding the manna. So when God gave them manna in the wilderness, remember they were told not to save any of it. If you gathered more than you could consume that day, it would rot and stink. Except on the day before the Sabbath, you were to gather up 2 days' worth, and it wouldn't stink. But God gave a special dispensation here. He wanted them to gather up some of the manna to keep in a golden urn inside the ark to remind them of how he provided for them. And of course, we're told, Jesus said of himself that he's that manna come down from heaven, that he is the manna. The second thing that they kept in there was Aaron's staff that budded. When God did this as a sign, as a miraculous sign, I mean, you take an old walking stick, it's dead, it's no longer growing. You don't use a green walking stick. Usually you get one that's dry and cured and going to last you a while. And God made Aaron's dead, dry rod bud, put forth almond buds. And God told them to keep that as a reminder that he's the one who gave them life. And the third thing were and the tablets of the Ten Commandments, that the very ones on which God wrote the Ten Commandments, and they were to keep that in there as a reminder of the law. So what do you have within this beautiful picture of redemption? You've got the manna that pictures Christ on whom we feed. You have Aaron's rod that budded that pictures that God makes us alive even though we're dead in trespasses and sins. And you have the law by which we're condemned, and yet which Christ perfectly fulfilled. So all of that was originally in the Ark of the Covenant. Now there's a lot of things we don't know about the Ark of the Covenant. First of all, we don't know exactly when it was lost. We are pretty confident. It never shows up again after 586 BC. So after Nebuchadnezzar conquers Jerusalem and destroys the temple, and we're not specifically told he gets the Ark of the Covenant. We don't know. Does he get it or not? And whatever happened to it, you have to assume that God somehow withdrew his presence from it. Because whoever stole it, I'm pretty sure that if everybody that touched it died, we'd have some record of that somehow. That would have been a remarkable thing that even an enemy army would have noted. The way the Philistines, when they stole it, God struck them with tumors. Some translations say hemorrhoids. Wherever they were, they were painful, and Philistines wanted no part of it and eventually gave it back. We don't know what happens to the Ark of the Covenant. It just disappears. So there are a lot of different theories, and does it still exist? My personal opinion is it does not. God has a way of getting rid of things that we would make idolatrous. He buries the body of Moses. We know Satan tries to get Moses' body. Why? Because he knows people will worship him if he can get his body. But Michael the archangel fights Satan over the body of Moses and doesn't let him have it. I think the Ark of the Covenant is sort of in that very same category. Man, if we had it, people would do anything for it, to see it. We've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, and there's a fanciful interpretation of what people would do with it. I don't think it would have that kind of power. I think if it were found, it would have no particular supernatural power anymore because everything's been fulfilled in Christ. But it would be one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time. There are some Jews who believe it's under the Temple Mount. And every time, there's a book you should read if you're interested in this kind of thing at all called Under Jerusalem. And it's about the history of archaeological digs under Jerusalem and basically how they've started wars. Even in my lifetime, I can remember when some Jewish archaeologists began just going into the tunnels that are beside the Temple Mount, not even underneath it. But the Palestinians, they remember, they're in control of the Temple Mount. Actually, it's this thing, it has a very creative name. It's called the status quo. And the status quo, when you hear whoever the prime minister of Israel is, he'll talk about we respect the status quo, we will maintain the status quo. He's talking about the agreement of the way they administer what the Jews call the Temple Mount and what the Arabs call, blank on their Arabic name for it. But basically, the king of Jordan is over the administration of the Temple Mount. So the Jews agreed to that. In the Six-Day War in 1967, this is still really, really debatable whether they did the right thing or whether they did too much or not enough. But Moshe Dayan goes in basically in a night with bulldozers, and they wipe out. If you see pictures of what's called the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall today, that was all houses, and they'd been there for, 150, 200 years. A lot of Turks lived there. They weren't truly Palestinians that had access there, but anyway, Moshe Dayan, and they cleaned it out. They bulldoze it and turn it into a holy site. And of course, this created, but sort of put the world on edge because there was concern that every single Arab country in the world was going to attack Israel, but Israel was riding high at the moment. 1973, in what was called the Yom Kippur War, on the day of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when Jews weren't expecting it, the Arab world attacked, trying to get it back. But even though Israel cleaned out all that area around the Temple Mount, they didn't go up on top. They didn't bulldoze the Al-Aqsa Mosque is up there, and then the Dome of the Rock. They had the power to do it, but they did not do it. Largely at the urging of the United States and some other Western countries, and they did not do it. And so this uneasy alliance is still there. If you go up on top of the Temple Mount to this day, you will find that Israeli soldiers are there largely to just protect Israeli citizens, but there are Palestinian police and there are caretakers to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Every now and then you'll be up there when there'll be hundreds of Palestinian women. And for years, Jews would not go up there. And one reason, and in fact, there used to be a sign over the entrance to the Temple Mount. By the way, Arabs can come in at 3 or 4 different points. They can come in. If you're not a local Palestinian, or if you're not, if you're not a local Palestinian, there's only one door you've got to come in. You're a Gentile, you're a Jew, you come in through this one particular door. The Arabs have access at several points to go in. And Jews wouldn't go up there because there was a sign over that main entrance that said, the chief rabbinate of Israel forbids Jews from coming here. So it wasn't the Arabs that were forbidding the Jews from going up there. It was the chief rabbi, because the chief rabbi believed that the Ark of the Covenant is buried underneath the Temple Mount, and that if a Jew steps on the spot over it, it would kill him. And so he says, don't go. Well, that only lasted so long. The first time I went to Israel, I was 16 years old. I saw with my own eyes 7 people stoned to death on the Temple Mount. I was there when that happened. And it was like the first time Jewish young people said, we don't care about the prohibition. This belongs to us. And they went up there, and you had a bunch of Arab youths waiting for them, and they literally stoned each other. And several of them, about 7 of them that day, I think, died from blunt head trauma. And I was there along with my dad and some others, and we got ushered out, and they locked down the old city. That was my introduction to the Temple Mount at 16 years old. Obviously didn't scare me off because I've been going back pretty much ever since. But it was by far the worst violence I've ever personally seen in Israel, and that was 1976, 3 years after the Yom Kippur War, and it was still really hot. Through the years, Israel has gained more and more control, but they have still honored the status quo. And so King Abdullah of Jordan, and before him King Hussein, his father of Jordan, are the custodians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. Oddly enough, when King Hussein was a little boy, he was in the Al-Aqsa Mosque with his grandfather for prayers, and his grandfather was assassinated right in front of him. And they tried to kill him, and they got him out of there, and he only survived. It was other Arabs. Again, the whole Middle East is so complicated. World War I sort of sets the thing, because so King Hussein and King Abdullah, they're called the Hashemite. It's the royal Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. That's not even their territorial land. So after World War I, it was divided up, and one of the sons of Faisal got that part, and Faisal gets Saudi Arabia. I mean, they chopped it all up, but they didn't necessarily give it to the people who lived there. And so the people who live there are still being reigned over by, they're all Arabs, but the whole Sunni Shia thing comes into play, and then whose bloodline is what, and it's really, really complicated. And then right in the middle of all these Arab countries, you've got this tiny little sliver of land that belongs to the Jews as a Jewish homeland. And even within their territory, it's complicated. So most recently, I think, Rose, were you guys with me one time when the women were ululating up there on the, so there, it heats up from time to time. And the Ark of the Covenant is a big part of it, because the Jews want to look for it. They want to burrow tunnels underneath there and search for it. And the Arabs go into an intifada if they do. We were there one time, though, and when Netanyahu said, okay, we're observing the status quo, but it's only right that Jewish young people should have access to pray up there too. And this caused a big stink. I mean, there were bombs lobbed and everything else around there. But finally, and it remains to this day that young Jews can go up there, but they can't take any religious articles. Like we're no longer allowed to take a Bible. You can't wear a T-shirt with a cross on it. Any religious artifact cannot be visible. Can't walk around with a Bible up there at all anymore. And when young Jews come up there, an Israeli police with machine guns will escort them as they walk around. Every time we go, we see that. A few years back, I think Rose and Daryl were with me. I know maybe a few others of you when they had hundreds of Palestinian women who would be up there, and when the Jews would come up there, walk around with their police escort, the women would ululate. Now, you know what ululation is? They do that, and I can't do it well, but they they do this real. If you ever seen Lawrence of Arabia, when Lawrence and the Arab armies leave Wadi Rum, the women stand on the cliffs as the army goes off, and they do it. You can see it in Lawrence of Arabia. And they were doing that. And so they just shout, and they followed the Jews around. And so there'll be like 6 Jewish youths walking around the Temple Mount, escorted by maybe 12 police with machine guns. And then you got these hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian women just going around and drowning them out with that ululation. And it's unnerving, to say the least, if you're not used to it. This is how complicated things are. And you just look at the history of the Bible, all the way back to Isaac and Ishmael. You know, you've got this struggle. And so much of what you read in the news gets down to what we're reading here about the tabernacle and the temple and the pieces of furniture. I mean, they believe the Ark of the Covenant is there. So if the Ark of the Covenant is buried up there somewhere, first of all, I think that's completely unlikely for a lot of reasons. One is, who and at what point would they bury it? When Titus comes there in AD 70, he absolutely obliterates the place. I mean, you can see stones on the ground outside the western wall that still have the burn marks on them. I didn't know you can burn limestone. But Titus gets it so hot, he burns stones. I mean, he makes it basically melt. And I'm just thinking, nobody is going to be up there digging a hole. First of all, it really is on rock, on bedrock. I mean, there's no place to bury it really underneath that couldn't be found. And secondly, they're fleeing for their lives. There's just not that much time. And thirdly, we don't even know that it was there then. We don't know of an Ark of the Covenant after 586. Which brings up the fascinating question of what are they doing on the Day of Atonement? We don't know. So much of this is just lost in the mist of history. Where did the Ark of the Covenant go, and how did they worship after it was gone? Herod the Great builds everything else in that second temple, but the Ark of the Covenant, I mean, did they build a new one? We don't know. And what happened to the old one, if there was a new one? All these things are just totally lost. Now, there's a group of Coptic, meaning Ethiopian Jews, Abyssinian, they're called Abyssinian Orthodox, that claim they have the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia. Have any of you seen documentaries where they show them? And this is totally unconvincing. They claim they have it in a building, and only their chief priest can go in and see it. There have been all kinds of journalists and people have gone, and they assure them they've seen it. People will tell them, "Oh yeah, I've seen it," but no proof ever comes, and how it ends up in Ethiopia would be hard to explain anyway. So we just don't know what happened to it. I think probably Nebuchadnezzar got it. I think also it's likely that in the second temple that they rebuilt one, but Titus would have taken it, destroyed it, and it's certainly not the original. I don't know that God ever honored it in any way, if it had any kind of supernatural abilities, if there was a second one. But all that's conjecture. We simply don't know. What we know is what God did in the beginning. We know from the building of the tabernacle until 586 that they have the Ark of the Covenant, and that it is used on the Day of Atonement. God honors it. We know what happens in the reign of David, and you know how Uzzah touches it, but it disappears. Now the veil of the temple is, we know how this ends. We know exactly where this is torn. this veil is a divider between the holy place and the most holy place. And its whole point is about being foreboding. It's a division. It says you can't approach God. You ever hear people when they talk about, when someone says, if God exists, one day you stand before God, what will you say to God? And people go, oh, well, buddy, he'll have a lot to explain to me, that kind of thing. I just think of all the stupid, arrogant things to say. God is not going to answer to anyone. And this veil is a reminder to us that you don't strut into the presence of God. We're going to talk about Nebuchadnezzar today, and Nebuchadnezzar sort of thinks he's something, and God shows him that he's not. And the Lord has a way of doing that for us. This veil is a reminder that there's a barrier between us and God. And only the high priest could enter into the most holy place. And by the way, if he doesn't do it exactly right, he's struck dead. He has to be completely obedient. The bells on the bottom of his garments have to continually ring. Why did God have that? Because his work is never done. It highlights that the ministry on earth never has an ending. It doesn't finish. Those bells had to constantly ring. But Jesus, when he offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. Jesus doesn't have to keep doing that. And by the way, that would be one of our huge disagreements with our Catholic friends who believe that in the Mass, Jesus is sacrificed again, anew and afresh, and that it is a perpetual sacrifice. And we emphasize, no, it was one sacrifice for sins forever, and he sat down. He does not continue to offer a sacrifice because the one he did was sufficient. So this veil pictures that our inability to approach God any other way. It's made of heavy woven cloth, blue, purple, and scarlet thread. Woven into it are pictures of the cherubim. Now that in itself is another discussion. If I say to you cherubim, I'm pretty sure we all picture what that is. But if I ask you, what is a cherubim? Do you know? I mean, the Bible speaks of angels, and at certain times it speaks of cherubim. That would be plural. Cherub is singular, cherubim is plural. And seraphim, a seraph would be singular, seraphim plural. But the Bible never explains what cherubim and seraphim are. We don't know. Are there different kinds of angels, or are these simply pictures of salvation? We don't know. This is one of the things we can discover in heaven. But the cherubim, this is used, you see it several places. You see this word used with regard to the Ark of the Covenant and the veil, that there were to be cherubim hovering over the Ark of the Covenant. And then we have cherubim before the throne of God who sing, holy, holy, holy. And but is this a picture of God's holiness? Is this a type of angel? Are there different races of angels? We don't know. But cherubim are indeed some type of an angelic being, as far at least in picture, and they hover over. In this, again, the picture is what is true of God's throne in heaven, and there, the angels they sing, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. In the book of Revelation, we read about 6 wings. With 2, they cover their eyes and cover their feet, and there's a picture of it. But whether or not this is literal or it's a picture of salvation, I'm not sure. But whatever they are, they were embroidered onto that veil, and they were also fashioned onto the Ark of the Covenant. So the veil is hung on 4 pillars of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. The 4 hooks were put in the 4 sockets of silver. There is no separation in the middle. The priest had to go around the side. There was no like opening in the middle the way you and I might do in our home. Notice this is a veil with no door. You literally can't go through it. But when Jesus dies, of course, we know it's torn in two. The writer to the Hebrews in Hebrews 10:19 writes of it, "Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way, that is, he opened for us through the veil, that is, through his flesh." We see that this veil is a picture of the flesh of Jesus, and when his flesh is broken for our sin, the veil is torn because Jesus' brokenness opens a new and living way for us to enter into the presence of God, and that's exactly what God does with this veil. And so he says, since we have a great high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Now look, remember I told you everything about the tabernacle is foreboding and saying you can't go. You should be fearful. Even if you're the high priest, you got to do it just right or God's going to strike you dead. Listen to what the writer of the Hebrews says. Because we have this new and living way, that the veil has been torn in two, let's draw near with a true heart in full assurance, full confidence of faith. Why? With our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience. Same way that the priest sprinkled blood on the mercy seat to make an atonement. He's saying Jesus has sprinkled his blood on us, therefore we are clean. We need not fear. Our bodies washed with pure water, the same way that the priest, before they could go in there, had to wash in that brazen laver. He said, our bodies have been washed with pure water. Let's hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, because he who promised is faithful. What a beautiful picture. It's no longer foreboding. Now it's opened up. We can draw near with full assurance. We can come boldly before the throne, before the mercy seat. We need not fear. And what a beautiful picture. So when the temple was later constructed, it followed a similar design. And that thick veil of the temple tore from top to bottom, symbolizing the ability of every believer, not just the high priest, to approach God through the death of Jesus. So the Ark of the Covenant, also called the Ark of the Testimony, is the central focus of the tabernacle in that Holy of Holies. It's the first item of furniture constructed after God told Moses to build the tabernacle. And really the purpose of the tabernacle is to house the Ark of the Covenant. It's the place where God met with and talked with Moses, and God set aside the tribe of Levi to carry the ark, to set it up, and to stand before him. Hear just more about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, when the priest comes to sprinkle blood on the mercy seat, and the friendship between God and his people is restored. God reached out and made it possible for people to know him through the blood of the covenant. And it's carried on those poles just like the other pieces of furniture. And let's see, here's the contents of the ark. So you've got the jar of manna, the tablets of the law, Aaron's rod that budded. Pretty much said that. And there's a representation of it. One last thing is that the mercy seat is that part on top of it. It includes the winged cherubim that face each other, what does the New Testament say? It says that the angels earnestly desire to look into these things. God has the angels witness the blood atonement, but it's not for them. It's not for them. That should just never be lost on us, that God gives no redemption to the angels. If an angel falls, he's cast out of heaven. He's now along with Satan and his demons, reserved for chains of everlasting judgment. No salvation, no redemption for angels. But he has them behold. Angels earnestly desire to look into these things. They know the grace of God, but only secondhand. They see God's grace for humanity. They are witnesses to it, but they are not recipients of it. What an incredible privilege is ours, that this thing that is symbolic of God's divine throne and presence was a picture to us of God's gift for us. And what an incredible picture of salvation. And let me ask any questions. I've covered a lot. Any questions anybody has before we take a break? Yeah.
Just a practical question, I guess. As far as when they enter the Holy of Holies, is there enough light that comes from the lantern over top of the curtain, or is it pitch black?
I think it's dark. Yeah, great question. He asks, so when they go into the Holy of Holies, is there enough light? I think it's pretty dark. I think he does it in darkness. I think everything about it, unless, is there a supernatural light? Does God shine forth from it? At least early in the day, when Moses would come from meeting with God, his face would shine. So I don't know. But yeah, there's no light in there. Yeah, that's right. They pull out their iPhone and this is how you can tell the old guys. When we're looking at our phone, the flashlight's on, We won't take a poll on who does that. But we don't know. We just don't know. There is no external light in there. So does he do it in darkness? Probably. Yeah, Rose? Okay, Rose has asked, you're saying like today. Yeah. So there's no temple, there is no sacrifice for sins. How do Jews believe that their sin is atoned for? Frankly, very, very few Jews have a belief that says that their sin needs to be atoned for. It's not like, for instance, I read, in preparing for this yesterday, I went to a Jewish website that talks about the sacrificial system, and it began with an apologetic saying that it was wrong to ever sacrifice animals. That was the first thing this website says, and it's written by a group of rabbis. So probably only the most Orthodox would even have a conception that they have sin that needs to be atoned for. They really do believe that this is God in covenant with his people, but that it's about the relationship, not about these acts. And again, that's sort of not wrong, right? But it's not wrong only when you got to get to the ultimate sacrifice that fulfills all these things. But basically, I would say, I have a lot of friends who are Jewish. I don't know any of them that have a concept that their sin needs to be atoned for. They believe that this is done through, I would say all of them have the conception of a mitzvah, that every day they have to do a good deed, and that this is what you do, that you do a good deed. It's not really a whole lot different from even a Muslim conception. I happened to be in Cave Hill Cemetery this past week and saw Muhammad Ali's tombstone, and it says something like, "Good deeds are the rent you pay for your room in heaven." And I just thought, well, I'm glad that's not true, because I couldn't afford that rent. I don't have enough good deeds to pay for that. But I would say that's how their conception of it is, that these were rudimentary early understandings that this is no longer the way God does it. Now, again, there's a hardcore group of Orthodox who believe that the temple should be rebuilt and there should be animal sacrifices. That's a small minority in all Judaism. And so most of them they don't think that's a thing. Good question, though. All right. Lord willing, we'll pick up there next week. We're going to talk about the temple, transition to the temple, and the feast. That's what Matt was supposed to cover, the feast last week, but didn't get to do that. So I will see you next week and again in a few minutes. Thank you.